Okay, so today we're going to talk about another one of our rules for exponents called the power to a power rule. Now before we talk about this rule, I want to just go back to the product rule really quick. So if we had x squared raised to the fourth power, if you remember that worksheet on the product rule, it was actually at the bottom of the worksheet, excuse the bell. We actually had to expand this to write it out 4 times. So as you guys remember, when you are multiplying things that have the same base, you add the exponent, and the answer then, was x to the 8th power, because 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 8. Now if you look at the problem and the answer, kind of ask yourself, well, how can I get from x squared to the 4th power and then x to the 8th? And if you said to yourself, well, you multiply 2 and 4 to get 8, you would be correct. So the shortcut that we're going to find for the power to the power rule is that when we have an expression raised to a power, we actually multiply the powers. Now we'll have to be careful with the coefficient, but when we have something with a power raised to a power, we multiply exponents. So let me just write out that rule really quick so you have it. So if we have a quantity with a power raised to a power, we multiply powers. In this case, we have x to the mth power raised to the nth power, and that equals x to the m times nth power. Those are multiplied together. So again, you multiply your exponents. And then make sure, though, for the coefficient, you raise it to that power, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And certainly while you're watching this video, I highly encourage you to copy this down in your notes as well, because that builds memory and helps with your retention. So let's start with the first example. So let's say we have x to the 7th raised to the 5th power. And hopefully if you look at the rule, you're realizing that would be x to the 35th power, because you simply multiply the 7 and the 5 and keep that base the same. Now building on that a little bit, for our second example, let's put a coefficient in front. So let's say we have 3 x to the 5th, and that's raised to the 3rd power. Well, as far as the x to the 5th goes, we'll still multiply the powers and we get x to the 15th. But what about the coefficient of 3? Remember, coefficients, for all the rules, you actually just do the operation that you have. Now, since this whole quantity is being raised to the 3rd power, we're going to take 3 and raise it to the 3rd power. So whatever the coefficient is, you take that and raise it to the power on the outside of the parentheses. So you can see that you're handling it a little bit differently than the base and the exponent. And if you do the math on that, 3 to the 3rd power is 3 times itself 3 times, not 3 times 3, and the answer would be 27. So your final answer is 27 x to the 15th. Moving on to the third example. Let's put 2 variables inside parentheses with the coefficient. So now we have 2x to the 4th y squared raised to the 5th power. And we'll start with the coefficient this time. So what we're actually going to do is take the coefficient and again raise it to the power on the outside. So we have 2 to the 5th power. Now I'm not going to do the math on that right now. Some of you might do that step right away. But I'm just going to write out as 2 to the 5th power. And now we have multiply our powers for x to the 20th, y to the 10th. Again, because now we have that power raised to the power situation. Now finally, 2 to the 5th power is 2 times itself 5 times, and if you take that in your calculator or figure it out, the answer would be 32. So my final answer is 32, x to the 20th, y to the 10th. Now, for our fourth example, we're going to put a negative coefficient with the problem. So let's say I have negative 3, x to the 7th, y, and that's the whole thing is raised to the third power. Well, in this case, you have to be careful. We're going to do it the same way, but just be careful with the negative coefficient because I see a lot of mistakes when we do this stuff with the signs. So we're going to take negative 3 raised to the third power, but I want to make sure I write that negative 3 in parentheses because I don't want to say 3 to the third power multiplied by negative 1. I want to make sure I say negative 3 raised to the third power, and by putting in parentheses, we are saying that. And the reason, again, why I put in parentheses for you guys is so when you if you were to type this in your calculator, you have to make it look exactly as I wrote it. You have to put negative 3 in parentheses raised to the third power. Otherwise, half the time, you would get the wrong answer, which isn't good odds. And finally, we'll do our exponents and multiply those. Remember, for the y, that has an exponent of 1. Some people forget that. So it's y to the third power, we multiply. And again, negative 3 to the third power is negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. So the final answer there is negative 27, x to the 21st, y to the third. So again, be careful with your negative coefficients. When you type those in your calculator, please make sure you put the negative coefficient in the parentheses. Otherwise, you'll get the wrong answer half the time. And one other key point with the coefficients, because this is where we see the most errors, is actually the coefficients. If you have a negative number raised to an odd exponent, that answer will always be negative. And just for a little side note here, if I have a negative number raised to an even exponent, that answer will always be positive. Like right here, this is positive 81. So that's a little cheat sheet for you. A negative number raised to an odd exponent is always negative. A negative number raised to an even exponent is always positive. And we'll do 2 more examples. These examples will involve fractions, but really the rule is still the same. And it probably looks a little bit confusing at first or a little overwhelming. So let's say I have a fraction, an entire fraction, raised to the 5th power. What you're actually going to do is you're going to treat it like 2 separate problems. You're going to take the numerator and raise it to that power, and then take the denominator and raise it to that same power. So we have x to the 3rd raised to the 5th divided by y squared raised to the 5th. So again, you can see it's just like 2 separate problems. We multiply powers here, x to the 15th. In the denominator, we have y to the 10th. I can't simplify that anymore because my bases are different. X and y are different, so therefore that is my final answer. Okay. And finally, one more with a fraction raised to a power, making it a little bit more advanced. So let's say we have negative 3y squared divided by 5x, and that whole quantity is raised to the 3rd power. Well, again, the same concept holds true. We want to take the numerator raised to that power, and then take the denominator and raise it to the same power. Okay. Now, again, for our coefficient, we're going to do negative 3 raised to the 3rd power, and I'll multiply the exponents for y to the 6th. In my denominator, I'll jump to that step right now. We have 5 to the 3rd power, and then x to the 3rd power. Now, the only thing we have left to do is take each of those coefficients that were in front of each of the parentheses, or first inside the parentheses, I should say, and raise them to those exponents. So we have negative 27 y to the 6th, negative 3 times itself 3 times, and then 5 to the 3rd is 125. Okay. So there is your lesson on the power to the power rule. The biggest errors I've seen in the past are students working with the coefficients. So be careful with your signs. Make sure to be careful when you have a negative number raised to a power. And make sure you treat the coefficients different than the bases and the exponents, because the bases and the exponents are very simple. You just multiply them. The most common areas I see for mistakes are the coefficients. Hopefully you enjoyed this lesson. I will be back tomorrow to answer any questions, but make sure if you had trouble with the lesson, you watch it again and pay close attention and record anything you need to help you in doing the worksheet and the homework. Thank you guys. Have a great day.